This is the Daily Divide. Parliament's year-long banking inquiry is wrapped, and the message is clear. New Zealand's big four banks are making higher profits than their overseas peers, while the competition remains weak. The Finance and Expenditure Committee says regulation is too heavy for smaller players and recommends 19 fixes, like forcing banks to reveal profits on everyday accounts, standardising loan processes so customers can easily compare deals, and lowering barriers for new banks and fintechs. The report also calls for a new Reserve Bank Prudential Policy Committee to keep a closer eye on efficiency and urges action to better serve Māori, including cutting anti-money laundering red tape for land trusts. But the inquiry admits there's no silver bullet, and politics is split. Labour and the Greens oppose loosening capital rules for opening the door wider to overseas banks, while the government backs easing regulations and boosting Kiwibank with fresh capital to shake up the market. The Reserve Bank will start consulting on its capital settings next week, and banks are expected to report back to MPs every 6 months. New Zealand has hit a trade wall in Washington. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon confirmed President Trump won't budge on a 15% tariff slapped on Kiwi exports, 5 points higher than expected. Trade Minister Todd McClay argued it was an unfair penalty for a modest surplus, but says the US is sticking to its formula. Surpluses mean 15%, deficits mean 10%. McClay did, however, secure talks on tackling heavily subsidised dairy practices that hurt both countries, and more meetings are lined up at ASEAN and APEC. Back home, the government has quietly axed Sport New Zealand's guidelines on transgender inclusion in community sport, bowing to a New Zealand First coalition demand. Officials had urged keeping the guidance, calling it vital for fairness, safety and inclusion, but Sport Minister Mark Mitchell says it's now up to the individual sports to decide, arguing the government shouldn't meddle in how codes are run. New Zealand has joined 27 countries demanding Israel allow foreign journalists into Gaza after an Israeli strike killed 6 Al Jazeera staff. The joint statement condemns the high number of journalist deaths, urges investigations into the attacks, and it repeats calls for a ceasefire, aid access, and a path to a two-state solution. But Wellington stops short of backing another international statement, this one condemning Israel's West Bank settlement expansion, signed by Australia, Canada and the UK. Meanwhile, questions are growing about New Zealand's own defence ties with Israel. The Defence Force hasn't ruled out buying Israeli drones, despite the Gaza war, saying procurement rules do not allow blanket bans by country. Defence Minister Judith Collins says she hopes to buy from local firms, but stresses she wants a more lethal force. Australia, meanwhile, is pouring billions into Israeli-made drones and counter-drone systems. Officials are warning New Zealand risks damaging its global standing on climate if it fails to meet Paris Agreement targets. After advice mistakenly released under the OIA shows ministries urged the government to lock in overseas carbon-cutting deals needed for 2/3 of our 2030 goal, but ministers have so far stalled. Officials caution that backing off could trigger a domino effect, giving large emitters like China cover to do less, while undermining ties with Five Eyes partners and Pacific neighbours. Without offshore projects, New Zealand faces an 80 million tonne shortfall, equivalent to electrifying every vehicle and halving farm emissions within 4 years, something experts say is unrealistic. Meanwhile, a major health report is calling for a wealth tax and a cross-party well-being strategy to shore up an overstretched system. The Public Health Advisory Committee warns of rising inequities, climate change and an ageing population are deepening health pressures. It says health starts in homes and communities and urges government to invest in fairer economic policies, reduce child poverty and address life expectancy gaps where Māori and Pacific peoples still live years less than Pākehā.